Welcome to a podcast produced by Lift Consultants, a company that is dedicated to supporting the culture in our schools across Australia. At Lift Consultants, we believe it takes courage to ask, but wisdom to listen. So join us as we consider multiple topics designed to help listeners with takeaways, tips, and insights. Thank you for listening.
Hello and welcome to this podcast. Today we're going to be focusing on a topic which covers all industries and probably all elements of our personal lives. And that topic is trust. Trust for leaders, trust in the workplace, but also trust just as everyday life and everyday experience. And there's a few things I'd like to call out at the start. My guest today is joining us all the way from the United Kingdom. You wouldn't think it. I look paler than he does. The sun is coming up nice and early in Berkshire in the United Kingdom, whereas in Brisbane it is 7:15 and the sun went down about 3 hours ago. So I've got all the lights on, doing my very best. It is my pleasure and my privilege to welcome to this podcast Mr. Tim Haycocks, who is a managing partner of Stowe Hill Estates. Tim, we'll just start straight off the bat. You just want to introduce yourself and then we'll dive right into our topic.
Absolutely. Well, thanks very much for having me. And thanks for allowing me to have the preferable lighting, which is always nice. Hello, everybody. I am Tim, as Rich mentions. Stowe Hill Estates, we're a real estate agent in the UK. My background is quite varied, though. So it's not an industry that I've always been part of, which we'll probably talk about a bit in due course, I guess. But in terms of what that means for this particular topic is that I won't say I'm uniquely placed, but I'm certainly well positioned to be fairly well opinioned on the issues of trust.
I think that's a really good intro. Immediately, I would imagine most people watching or listening would identify the potential clash. We have trust and we have a real estate agent. Now, with amongst politicians and used car salesmen, I would imagine you're up there. For some of those people, it can take a little bit of a while, to build that rapport. We were talking just before we started our recording today about some of the statistics that have come out from Tracy Brower in a Forbes article. She actually said that 61% of people believe that business owners will lie or exaggerate to mislead their customers. And then 63% people believe that politicians would do it. And 64% would suggest that the media and journalists actually would exaggerate in order to mislead their audience and obtain a certain outcome. So trust as a concept in society is one thing, and then it's how we build it as professionals that we're really interested in exploring. Tim, straight off the bat, as a real estate agent, which is very much an Australian term, so we understand if you go into estate agent or some of the other different terminology. Well, your thoughts and your perspective on those statistics in Forbes?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, and I'm going to add to them. I'm going to go one step further. One thing that I look at and have looked at for the last few years is there's a Ipsos, so the global market research company. They publish what they call their annual veracity index, and that actually talks about most trusted, least trusted, differences across gender, etc., etc. And I think one of the challenges that estate agents or real estate agents definitely face is based on Tracy's articles, based on the Ipsos data, with the fifth least trusted profession, right? So, like you say, there's what I'd probably call the usual suspects in terms of, politicians, government ministers, journalists, and advertising execs. I think they're the four that kind of sit in front of the real estate profession.
Right.
And really interestingly as well, there used to be a bit more of a divide between female estate agents and males. So in 2022's version of that report, there was about 5% greater propensity for people to trust a female agent than there was a male agent. In 2023's report, that's nearly flat. It's only 1% difference now. So I've still got a slight disadvantage, but nonetheless, it's interesting to see that there's a change that basically isn't a positive change. It's a change that's saying, actually, rather than trusting both of you more, we just trust the female agents less. And I totally get why people have that perception or where it comes from. I mean, it is perhaps unfortunately typically based on overwhelmingly negative experiences. But I guess the important thing is, like in any walk of life, there are exceptions. But when those exceptions are in the minority, hopefully I put myself in that minority basket. But you have to work pretty hard to prove yourself most of the time. And one thing that we find is that when we do that and when we interact with people and suddenly they realize that there is a different face to real estate, they're normally quite surprised. And that's great, right? It's really gratifying from my point of view to know that we're doing something that other people aren't. But it's also fractionally worrying because the bar is probably pretty low in the first place. I guess I wish the stats were wrong. And as we all know, you can prove anything with numbers. But in this case, they're probably pretty fair based on like external perceptions. I think probably the thing that is I really want to reference industry specific as opposed to more generic is that I think a lot of that perception is probably based on kind of legacy models and legacy agents. In the UK, we have quite an old-fashioned version of the industry where you've got this old-fashioned corporate model where individuals within the businesses they're actively incentivized to bend the truth because it's to their advantage. And we won't go into the details on that right now, but the industry is changing, and there are now a far greater number of agents in the self-employed model. And the net of that is that it's much more in their interest to make sure that people like them, trust them, want to work with them, because they can't rely on the kind of corporate backing. So there is definitely a shift, and it's nice to see that there is a kind of positive momentum shift. Shaking off a lot of that legacy perception is difficult, and it takes a long time.
It's really interesting. Two things really jumped out to me there while you're speaking. One was I wondered if there was a difference between a buyer, a client who's engaging you to say, "Hey, can you help me find a house?" or somebody who's engaging you to say, "Can you help me sell my house?" I wonder if there's a difference between those two. And the second thing you said was there is a need for them to like you and trust you. And I wonder if there is a correlation there. I wonder if you can be trusted and not liked. In my head, that feels possible. You could be an absolutely horrible person, but I know you're getting the job done and you've got my best interests at heart. And I suppose does my best interests actually mirror match, or does it go against the best interests of the other party? Because it's buying and selling, it's trading, isn't it? It's a financial arrangement and agreement. So just breaking those two down, the differences between the services you're providing, who you're working for, and the importance of being liked in your personal opinion.
So yeah, really good points, because it's something that is a constant challenge, I guess, for us. Naturally, our client is always the person that's selling the house. However, there becomes a point in that transactional relationship where also we're working with a potential buyer. And from the point that we first meet that buyer, we also want to engender a degree of trust and personal connection with them, because that's in our interest to try and help facilitate the sale. Where that line really blurs is when we have conversations probably around the point where people start to make offers. So if you've got a buyer who's making an offer on a property and I'm going back to them and saying, "Thanks very much for your offer, but really pleased that you're interested, but that offer's not good enough, like it's not going to get us there," why would they believe me? Like, to what extent am I actually saying genuinely, that particular seller isn't going to let the property go at that level, versus me just trying to line my own pocket, earn more commission, that type of thing. So there is a real, not conflict of interest, but it's a difficult line to walk. I mean, we are obligated, if somebody makes an offer on a property, we're obligated to put that offer forward to the vendors, right? Now, theoretically, that should mean that everyone being created equal, all real estate agents, when they receive an offer from a potential buyer, tell the vendors about it. Doesn't always happen. We know this from our own clients, people that we are working with to sell their houses, they're buying a house too. And we'll have conversations with them about their experiences. And they will often say, oh, yeah, we've put an offer forward, but the agent keeps saying, he'd like to talk to the sellers about it, but he hasn't yet. And he wonders if we want to change it. So there is, again, like that, from a trust point of view, that can kind of harm that side of the relationship. So perhaps more than anything else, on the buying side, what I have to try and do when we walk that tightrope is find a way in which I can be genuine to the degree that that buyer understands that what I'm telling them is in their own best interest and is essentially true of what the feedback is that I'm getting from my vendors. And sometimes that means that I have to give them, bad news and tell them that their offer is not accepted. Sometimes it means that I have to give them perhaps additional insight to help explain why and give them something else to think about. And actually, the irony of that is potentially a difference between me losing a sale and not losing a sale. It'd be really easy just to go, oh, brilliant, thanks very much, offer accepted. Like, I don't want to go back to them and say you're a million miles away from what that seller's expecting. But equally, the seller's my client and I need to represent them first and foremost a lot of the time. So that's a really tricky one. The other end of the spectrum is the seller relationship. So the interesting thing on that side of things, they are our clients. So typically we spend a lot of time with them. We might, if you think about how that life cycle works and what that process looks like, from the point of first contact, whether that's, they phoned us or we've reached out to them somehow, from that first point, we're building that relationship. And at the point where they decide to use us as their real estate agent, they've selected us for one reason or another. Sometimes people will make choices based on price, right? And so they might say, we're working with that particular agent because we're most focused on what our fees are going to be and we want the lowest possible number. That's never going to be us. We don't operate in that model. That's not how we want to run the business anyway. So normally, if that's the case, we'll probably lose out in that scenario. They'll choose somebody else. But there's this really interesting transitional point between price and value. And I've said this to people before when they've said to me about our fees, is there any flexibility? Often I would just come back with the point that if you don't understand at this stage the additional value that I'm bringing to the relationship and the additional value that I'll create for you on the sale end, then I've probably done a bad job of explaining it to you. So let me know what aspects of that it is that kind of don't sit well with you, because the service that I'm going to deliver is ostensibly very different to the service that you're going to get from agent B or C or D. And so from a pricing point of view, that becomes an interesting conversation. And the thing I think with trust is agents are famous for this, right? And this is one of the problems that the profession has, full stop. They will overvalue somebody's property when they first speak to them, tell them it's worth, $10 million. And then the owners go, oh, fantastic. I didn't think my house was worth that much money. I can get loads more for this than I thought. I'll definitely give you the business. And normally then what happens is, fast forward a couple of weeks, maybe a month, and the sales team of that agent, who, by the way, are different people to the valuers and targeted differently, say, we can't sell it for $10 million. It's worth $50,000. So we're going to have to change the price. And that's why you see lots of people launch properties, change price. And it can be really harmful to the transaction. And that's, unfortunately, that's because they aren't being given transparent information in the first place. Because if they're fully transparent and they're building that trusted advisor relationship, I might say to them, well, look, being pragmatic, your house is probably worth this in a strong market, but there's a bit of work that you need to do. You're probably not ready to launch it yet. Here's what I would do for you, and here's how I'd suggest we market it. And sometimes that's not what people want to hear. So you have to be really delicate with how you deliver that information, but you do have to be honest, because ultimately it's in everyone's best interest to do it. So the buyer-seller dynamics, people trust you for different reasons, or people are used to hearing, let's call them half-truths or untruths for different reasons from people in the industry. So when we kind of bounce into that scenario and start telling people other things, which they perhaps haven't heard from other agents, I would say regularly, the feedback that we get is this has been a totally different experience. This is night and day to previous conversations, because we're just not telling, we're not paying lip service to something. We're telling people, if you want to sell your house, this is how we're going to help you do it. But these are things that you need to be aware of.
I think that actually gives us a really nice transition into you and a little bit of your background, because as you're speaking there, really it actually comes down to character. Yes, you've got your professional setting. Yes, you've got the service you're delivering. And perhaps for some, Tim, it isn't a difficult line to walk. You used the term tightrope, and that would suggest that actually it is something you are trying to navigate, and there is a balance there and a friction which you are trying to maintain. It would be entirely reasonable and possible that other agents wouldn't do any of that. They would just do what they need to do in order to line their pockets. So that takes us on to character, I suppose, and a little bit of your history. Now, you and I have known each other for many years, despite being 16,000 kilometers, that's 10,000 miles, 10,000 miles apart. You've worked in lots of different industries. You have been a leader in your field in lots of the things that you've done, and all the way from the tech side of industry in the working world, and now into real estate. To what extent is trust a common factor in all that you have done?
I mean, it's the constant in anything where there's a relationship. Ultimately, irrespective of industry or specialism or profession, business and professional interactions are based on relationships. It's sort of a cliche that people often say, "Oh, people buy from people." There's definitely an element of truth in that. People buy from people because they believe what the person's saying, and that comes back to trust. They trust the information that they're being given. They trust that they're operating in their best interest. They trust that they aren't going to tell them one thing and then deliver something else that isn't what they asked. So to give you a 1,000-mile view, one of my first jobs that I ever had was teaching. And I was a music teacher. So I was a peripatetic music teacher, and I'd go to different schools and institutions, and I worked privately as well. And I mean, trust in that capacity is a really interesting one, because people were trusting me with the education of their children, right? They're trusting me with the fact that they're paying me money privately to deliver a service that they don't have to. It's an optional thing, right? So if the kids turn up and leave again and they haven't really progressed or learned anything or made any meaningful, increases in ability or even in personality, that's the other side of it, right? It facilitates growth in that respect too. Why would they trust me to continue that relationship? And so you'd start to lose clients, as it were, lose relationships. So that was a really interesting aspect to it. And then I suppose if I fast forward a little bit from that, I went from that world, that industry, into probably more corporate structures for a long time, and in various capacities, right? Some things were working with existing customers, some things were working with new clients, some things were working with internal stakeholders in lots of different industries and at lots of different levels. And until prior to the business that I'm in now, was reasonably senior in different companies and holding different positions and running different teams of people at the same time. I think the one thing for me that was always absolutely paramount in all of those things was being believable. Believability sort of equates a little bit to trust, believe it or not. And it was that desire for people to see you as genuine, but also feel comfortable saying to you, I have this problem, can you support me with it? As much as me saying, I actually have a problem and we need to do something differently. And then people responding well to that feedback, because we've got the depth of relationship that allows us to have two-way dialogue. And that works in all directions, right? You communicate up as well as down. And so it has to be the case that you have the ability to be able to do that multi-directionally. I think the piece that has probably, I suppose, stuck with me more than anything else from those experiences and my previous experience is that ultimately it doesn't matter where you're working, who you're working with, what job you're doing, you're still working with other human beings. And until the rise of the machines takes place, then we will still be doing that. And so, human nature and perception is really important. Everybody has different personality types. Everybody has different wants and needs and desires. And sometimes you get, everyone knows the stats about 7 seconds to make a first impression and all those types of things. But ultimately, post your first impression, you do get different durations of time. People come in and out of your life or your career at different periods. And sometimes you have loads of opportunity to build depth of relationships, and sometimes you don't. But if your objective and, you know, collectively is that whilst you're engaging together and you're operating together, you believe that you can both, you know, work in each other's best interest or pull in the right direction or support difficult conversations or, you know, whatever it might be, all of that comes through that depth of relationship, which for me hinges more than anything else on trust.
I think that's beautiful. And in my head, Tim, I like to think if you're willing to sit down and watch or listen to a podcast on the topic of trust, it to me would suggest that you're the type of leader who is looking to either be better in that space, just to affirm their thinking. It's an effort, right? It takes a bit of work to go into it. If we were to imagine new leaders in this upcoming world, and I have a real strong belief that this next generation of leaders are very different to the leaders that have gone before.
Mm-hmm.
I've spoken to a lot of people. I've said, this is the work I want to do going forward. I really want to build trust in organizations between people. And there's a common thread across industries. People are like, oh, Richard, they don't want to hear it. And I think they're right. They never did want to hear it. I believe right now, this next generation, these people coming through, I don't even know what generation we're on anymore. I actually think they are connected and they do value connection and relationships and people. So if we were to take a brand new leader, either aspiring or just appointed, and you could just give them, I'm going to use that horrible term, elevator pitch. You can just give them that little bit of a pitch and say, this is why trust is important. What would you say?
Well, I think so. One of the interesting things, because I totally agree, by the way, right? I think that as society a little bit starts to, you know, evolve and change, and if you look back to, you know, Gen X, like 40 odd years ago, one thing that I've certainly found is as you're managing younger people as you get older, expectations and interactions change, right? And the way that they want to operate changes. Probably of the last, where are we? Of the last 80 years, right? Post war, one of the biggest societal changes that's happened was COVID lockdown. That, I think, dramatically changed how people worked together and how people interacted. I mean, the difference between being able to build a meaningful relationship in person with a human being in the same room where you can pick up on all the minutiae of unconscious body language and things like that, versus working remotely over Zoom, where you're on a call for half an hour and then you hang up again, and who knows what's happening in the background or off camera or what have you, right? Like it's totally different. And I think a lot of people, you know, who started even their careers in, you know, sort of 2018, 2019, their first formative years of work were based very often largely around everything being totally remote. Like I had a job during COVID where I never went to the office. I never met the people I worked with and left again. So like I never had the opportunity to go and do the normal things, quote unquote. And one thing that I found is when life started to revert a bit, go back to normal, and you could, you know, go back into the public domain and what have you, and see human beings in the flesh. Lots of the people that, certainly the younger generations I had in teams at the time, were almost, I'm going to say nervous, because I won't say it's reluctant, but they were almost a little bit nervous, reticent maybe, to get out there and go and see people face to face. I can't remember another time in my career where I've said to a team of people who have carte blanche to go and, like, you know, see somebody, get out of the office, take somebody for lunch, go for a drink after work, just use the time however you want to use it. And no one's taking me up on it. Like 10 years ago, if I'd said that, there would have been nobody there. Like it would have been like a mass exodus. Like, right, lovely, see you later. So, but those things have changed massively. So coming back to your question in terms of like your elevator pitch for what's important,
Well, it's a
how
lot
you
of
build that.
floors. It's a lot of floors. It's like
Yeah,
a
yeah, it's a
300
big
floor
elevator.
building, mate, and it's a slow
But
elevator. You keep going.
but the reason that I mention it is because that, to me, I think is still fundamentally important. When you think about building a relationship with somebody, it's the ability to spend meaningful time with them. Now, meaningful doesn't have to mean in the same room, doesn't have to mean face to face, because often that's not feasible, viable. We don't always work with people in the same countries, territories, etc. However, if you have the option to do it, that is what I would always put kind of front and center. That's like my version one. FaceTime is so important if you have the opportunity to do it. And if you don't, that's okay too. But you're just going to have to probably find different ways to work a little bit harder or be a bit more creative with how you go about building that relationship. Because the trust comes from the relationship, and the relationship very often will come from commonality or similarities or shared interests or shared objectives or goals or whatever those things might be. And sometimes you might be in a professional capacity, you might be working with somebody where you've got lots of those things because you're trying to do the same thing. Equally, you might not have some of the other things because you've been kind of put together as a job. So it doesn't mean you have the same interests. It doesn't mean you do the same things at weekends or in the evenings. So actually, sometimes you have to try and work out how do I remain flexible? How do I adapt my personality? How do I adapt my style of delivery? How do I make sure that I'm kind of consciously taking on board what that individual or those individuals are responding well to, so that I can get the best out of that relationship and build towards having a more impactful relationship more quickly?
I think it's really interesting. Just earlier today, I was doing some research for another client regarding the impact of COVID on the population of Australia, because migration essentially stopped, so people didn't come in, and it's actually changed the workforce significantly, and the demand for schools in certain regions. The other thing is, when you were talking about put the time in, did another podcast with a gentleman by the name of Nick Burnett, and he's a real, I won't say advocate, he calls himself a techno optimist. So he really looks at AI and thinks, yeah, this is a real opportunity for us. And he actually said we should use AI to do the things which would then allow us to go be leaders. And there's real correlation to what you were saying there. So AI can do this for me over here, so I can go and have FaceTime with people, because that's what leadership is, and that's where relationships come from, and that is the foundation of trust. So it's really interesting. You've got one podcast on psychological safety, which wasn't coming from a deficit model. It very much was. This is a really interesting term. Lots of people are talking about it. Let's unpack it. And then we've got one on trust, which was probably more, again, on a surplus. Like, this is something we love and something we all want. And there's this real interconnectivity between them, which brings relevance, I think, to both discussions. I wanted to go back to Tracy. She gives a couple of suggestions in her article as to this is how you build trust. So I'm just going to read them to you. All I was hoping you would do is just pick the one. I mean, there's one which I think jumps out off of the page based on everything you said. So we'll see. Actually, I'll just put a little comment. The comment will be underneath the video. This is what I think he's going to say. Read comment. And we'll just see if I was close. Suppose I could have changed the comment, but never mind. Anyway,
You won't because we trust you.
That's trust. That's trust. Because FaceTime, build a relationship. So there you are. These are the staples of building trust with people you work with, work for, lead. Be transparent and authentic. Be consistent and aligned. Be competent and humble. Be empathetic and ethical. Be present and accessible. I love them all. I think they're all brilliant. There's no doubt about it. And I'll read them again in a bit, because I think if somebody's listening, that's their takeaway. Tracy's a PhD. She's smarter than I am. That's what you've got to take away. But your perspective of those five, what jumped out at you as I was reading them out?
I mean, they all jump out for different reasons, ironically. But to me, when you break it back to what we've been talking about and kind of my thoughts around trust being about relationships being about people, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, that empathy part's always super important. but so is the authenticity and the transparency. Like, one of the things that I suppose I would probably add to it, because I don't think it was mentioned in that list, is accountability. There is so much value in terms of building trust with somebody in owning something. Like, if you get something wrong, you make a mistake, the accountability side of that, what that demonstrates to someone, I think ultimately it all probably leads back into authenticity and transparency and that side of it. But for me, like, it's really important that people know that you're a human being. There's a vulnerability aspect. So, people want to see that you are real. You are who you say you are. You're not, especially if it's in a leadership role, right? You're not just in your ivory tower of rolling around and telling people what to do all day. Like, that's a totally different way of interacting. And maybe that's perhaps a slightly more legacy version of how leadership used to work. But leadership today is a very different thing entirely.
Absolutely.
And the other thing I would probably add to that is, from the perspective of that accountability side of things, or the vulnerability side of things, somebody, I can't remember where I read it, years and years and years ago, once said to me, really, if you're building a new relationship with somebody, and especially if you feel like perhaps it's a difficult relationship, or they're not quite on board, or they're coming at it from a sort of angle of skepticism or something, a really quick way to get somebody to kind of buy into you is to change the dynamic of the relationship, so that you kind of reverse it, so that it becomes a you need them more than a they need you type thing. And the easiest way often to do that is just to take something really small, like small favors, and ask them if they can help you with something. So it's almost that case of, I've had this before, where I've had people in teams who have been, had previous leaders. Some of them weren't always great. New guy comes in, like, who the hell's this guy? What's he going to do? And they don't really want to kind of believe that you might be different. And some of the fastest ways that you get kind of from that to, okay, maybe this is going to be okay, and perhaps we've got some common ground. Like, often that can just be as simple as saying, like, I don't know how to do this. Can you help? Or I need some information about this. I know you're the expert. Can you fill me in? Those types of kind of small gestures just start to psychologically change the dynamic of the relationship, and they can be really impactful.
I love that, and it's the small gestures, right? How they all add up. I was going to be transparent and authentic. That's what my comment said back there. So now I can't cheat. It was going to be authentic and transparent. So when you went to empathy, I was like, no, authentic and transparent. So, but you're right. And in my notes, I actually, instead of accountability, I'd be effective, and that was be good at your job. And I think by being effective, getting it done, and just meeting the brief, people see that you get it done. I just wanted to acknowledge, as a graduate of history, how society, again, it's really interesting. Like, that wasn't a theme of this podcast, but society has changed. So leadership models have changed. The generations' work and expectations, they have changed. And vulnerability used to be weakness, and now actually it's pretty much a strength. Whether Brene Brown's got a lot to answer for. She's completely flipped that dynamic and made vulnerability a superpower. Fair play to her. Like, that's outstanding. It certainly changed the way I think. And if all of those things continue, it just, I guess, it raises the question, like, what's coming next? How do we keep it going, and how do we make sure that trust is going to remain when the next generation after the next generation? But for now, the relationships, character, the power of the individual, the ability to be authentic, demonstrate empathy, and actually hold true to who you are and what you do, and I guess your purpose and the work you're trying to achieve. I think they're really beautiful ingredients for somebody who is looking to build trust with a team. Any closing thoughts, Tim, before we wrap this up?
I suppose the only other thing that we haven't touched on, that I think is always really important and kind of cuts across all of this, because it allows you to do all of those things, is like active listening. That the difference between kind of being, here are our core values, this is our value statement as an establishment, and this is what we're supposed to be living by, often you don't always see that represented in the way that people behave or carry themselves, etc. And the value statement that anybody has ultimately will always come back to, how do I apply that to the individuals within my organization or customers that I work with? And the only way that you can kind of correlate the two is by listening to either the people inside or the people outside, and kind of understanding what their needs are, what their requirements are, like how you can apply those values to them. That would be my only kind of additional thought, because I think that's something that can make the difference between, you know, somebody that is present and somebody that is unbelievable.
And, you know, I think I'm just looking, I think because in some ways it is really easy to roll that in with authenticity, but there is a be present, which I think sort of fits in there. And but also I like the word genuine. Be genuine. The problem with being genuine is it does actually depend on the character of the individual that is being genuine. And I think that's something which I'm probably still wrestling with in terms of the working world. You can be as genuine as you want, but if you're not a nice person, nobody wants you to be genuine. You can be as authentic as you want, but if you're an absolute idiot of a person in the eyes of the majority of society, then unfortunately you're not going to build trust. There's a lot to be said here about character, and all of the factors that influence it. I mean, there's a whole podcast there. You know, where does character come from? Well, what a question. And you know, I guess it's never set, right? Develops over time, whether through the school of hard knocks or glorious victories. Character is always developing, and maybe there's a generational conversation in there in terms of, I would say the younger generation know who they are earlier than we did, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're right. It doesn't necessarily mean they're not going to change. And I think that's probably the grey area in there, which is going to be really beautiful for them as they try to establish trust, going from the led to the ones who lead. So I think that's beautiful. Well, we're coming up to our 40-minute mark, so we're going to leave it there. But thank you so much. I genuinely look like a vampire in a cave. It's killing me. Absolutely killing me. Every time I look at my side of the screen, I'm thinking, that's awful. I look really sick. And then I look at yours.
Fix it in post-production. It's fine.
I honestly, I don't think there's any amount of editing or AI that's going to take away from what I'm seeing on my screen. Whereas Costa del Berkshire over there is looking super glorious. It is your summer and our winter.
We are experiencing one of the most disappointing summers that I've ever experienced, and that's coming from somebody that, you know, lives in the UK. So imagine how bad that is.
Well, look, I could tell you 20 degrees here today, blue sky and sunny, and I had to wear a hoodie because I was so cold. So
I'm not sure we haven't hit 20 degrees yet. So
my life has changed. I'm in a short sleeve shirt. I'm actually braving it for you. I want you to know it's not as cold as it looks in the cave. I promise you, it's much better. Tim, thank you very, very much for your time this morning / my evening. Ever insightful, and honestly, coming from an individual working in your profession, which does have the stereotype, which is exactly what we wanted to explore. I think you have demonstrated that a person can transcend all of that, and they can still do great things in an industry which has got some challenges before you even step out the door. So well done for overcoming that, and it's a credit to you and the team at Stowe Hill Estates.
Thank you. That's extremely kind of you. We'll endeavour to keep doing exactly that.
Yeah, don't mess it up. All right, everybody, thank you very much. That was a podcast on trust, Richard Cornish and Tim Haycocks. We do hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you again soon for another edition. Take care.